Welcome to our Research Like a Pro with DNA question and answer series. And today we are talking about how to write about DNA terms and methodology in a research report. So, this came about because in our study group, we are all trying to write reports using DNA, and that can be really challenging. How do you cover all the information that is in DNA that you want to put into a report? So we obviously have to be kind of choosy and we have to think through this a bit. So the first thing we have to do, think about the challenges. And here are some of the ones that I identified, and there might be even more. But we don't know how much our reader actually knows about genetic genealogy. There is a lot of jargon that we use as genealogists. I remember I taught a class once at Roots Tech that was on DNA, and it was supposed to be for all people, all levels. But one of the comments I got was that I never defined a centimorgan. I just assumed everybody in the room knew what a centimorgan was. And so we have to always be careful of never assuming our readers know everything that we know or that we are familiar with. And then DNA does involve a lot of complicated tools and methodologies that as we're learning and we put them to use, they become clear in our mind. But how do you actually explain those and discuss those in a report without overwhelming it with too much? So let's break those down. We've got the reader's knowledge of genetic genealogy. So we've got people that know absolutely nothing. They've never tested their DNA. They don't know what that means. I know when I told my dad about DNA testing years ago, he wondered if they had to exhume bodies to compare DNA. And of course, we don't do that, thankfully. But, a lot of people seriously do not know anything. Now, some people might have taken a test, and a lot of people do this because it's so fun to get those ethnicity results. And maybe they have actually even worked a little bit with their DNA and they know some of the tools, and maybe they are pretty good researchers and they've done a lot of research and they would just understand what you're talking about. But because our reports may be going to someone that knows nothing, when you write your report, often we'll anonymize it and put it out there for other cousins or other people researching the same lines, and we never can assume that they have that good knowledge. Now, where do we actually add this information in a DNA report? Well, we have got some interesting places to put it. We can put it in the body of the report, just like writing it right into the report, or some of it could just go into a footnote. That's often a great place to put a little detail. Or maybe we put it in the appendix. Always we want to start with the foundation. And so we will explain some basics of DNA inheritance. We will define those simple terms like centimorgan or segments, and then we'll consider the methodology. So let's look at each one of these. You don't need to define all the kinds of DNA inheritance if you're not using them all. But if you are doing a project, a case, and you have been using mitochondrial as the foundation, then of course you'll want to explain that. The same with the xDNA, yDNA, or autosomal DNA. So you'll just consider which one you're using or if you're using multiple and explain those. So here's an example of how you could put this in the body of the report. And this is using yDNA. And one thing that you have to remember is you don't always have to write this yourself. You can quote an expert. So in this little bit taken out of a report that I wrote, I used genetic genealogist Blaine Bettinger and Debbie Parker Wayne's book. And I don't show the citation here, but I do have it cited in my report. And I just use their words. One of the oldest and most powerful genetic genealogy tools is the Y chromosome, because each man's Y chromosome is nearly identical to the Y chromosome that his many great grandfather possessed. The Y DNA line can be traced back very far. And then I added my own example, my own explanation. So when analyzing a Y-DNA STR test, each difference or mutation between two men is added up, and the total is termed genetic distance. Usually, the greater the genetic distance, the further removed the common ancestor will be. A father and son would likely have 0 as a genetic distance. More distant cousins would likely have a larger number for the genetic distance. So, this is a pretty simple explanation. And then immediately following this, I would discuss the Y-DNA testing, and they already have a little bit of background about that genetic distance. And what I'm going to put next in the report will make better sense. Now, what if we feel like we need an even longer explanation? Well, here's an example, and we're not going to read all of this, but this is an example of Y-DNA where we sent the reader to the appendix. And this gives a lot more detail. It goes into the different types of Y-DNA tests with the short tandem repeat and the single nucleotide polymorphisms. And so if you want to do a more involved bit, then that could certainly go in the appendix, especially if that's going to be really important for your reader to understand what is going on in your report. Now, when it comes to defining terms, usually simple is better. We have all read descriptions of DNA that are very involved and complex and difficult to understand, but remembering our reader who probably doesn't know that much about what we are using, we want to be simple, and visuals are always fabulous. So we always want to think of what we can put out there to show what we're talking about. So let's look at an example of a very simple explanation. So back to my idea of not having defined a centimorgan, I certainly should have had a slide or two in my presentation on what a centimorgan is. So in this case, if you're writing a report, you could just have a footnote where you explain it. It wouldn't necessarily need to be in the body of the report. So here's an example of a simple statement that could be in a footnote, that a centimorgan is a unit of measure for the frequency of genetic recombination. The higher the CM, the closer the relationship. So this would help someone to see that you're going to be using, for one thing, the CM for centimorgan, and it would help them to just get a handle on what this actually means. Now, we do have the term genetic recombination, so that might be something that we also will need to define because that's an important concept as well. Here's an example of a visual. And if you're writing a lot of DNA reports, you might want to create a visual that you could use over and over. In fact, it's really a good practice once you have written something up to your satisfaction to save that in your own document that you can go back and use over and over with those statements, those explanations. So remember, a visual is often your best teacher. If you are doing a visual, don't just throw the visual in there. Make sure that you have a little bit of narrative before explaining it. Give the visual, and then you could perhaps use an example from whatever DNA project you're using that's relevant for that discussion. Now, you also want to think about defining, discussing the methodology. And this will come after you have built that basic foundation of DNA inheritance in any terms. And so we don't want to jump into methodology. We wouldn't jump in and talking about, say, triangulation without explaining what segments are or giving some background. And we don't necessarily need to discuss every single methodology that we used in the research. You may have tried several different tools and you really only used two or three. Only two or three were the ones that really got you to your answer. So consider perhaps weeding that out a bit. Your research log that you've been keeping along with this project can have all of the methodologies that you've been using, the different clustering, all the different tools you've used. But think about what's most relevant. What is the best information that you gained from your methodology and put that into your report. Now, when you are writing about your methodology, you want to introduce it, give some explanation about what it means. And remember, we've already given some basics, so now we can build on that. And then we can reveal what was found. We can tell what was specific to the project. So here's just an example of some of the methodologies you might be writing about. You might be writing about clustering, genetic networks, pedigree triangulation, segment triangulation, wide DNA analysis, mitochondrial DNA analysis, or using the X chromosome. And there are others that perhaps you might have used, maybe some other tools or third party tools that are helping you with some of these. So you will just pick the ones that are the best. So here's an example of a little explanation in a narrative format that can be used over and over and over when you are explaining the leads method. The leads method is a way of clustering DNA matches based on shared match groups. The idea is that everyone belonging to a certain cluster will most likely descend from the same familial lines. This method is useful in determining which matches descend from which line of the family. So this would just be a simple explanation, and then following that, you could have the leads chart that you created. Now, if you want to do a little bit more, you could have something in the appendix where you actually show an example and then you could say how it was created. So that if someone is curious and they want to know how you created this beautiful chart, they can certainly go back and read about it and learn about it. So I think it's really good to think about our reports as being educational. And we want to teach people. Maybe someone has never even thought about this technique, never heard of this, but they're intrigued with the colors and the idea of sorting. What a great way to just give them a little tip about how they could use it or how it works. So, as we close this up, we've given a few fun ideas about writing about DNA in a research report. So, just think about your reader. It's so easy to assume that everybody knows what a centimorgan is, but we have to remember that we've been working with DNA for quite a bit, and things we take for granted, our reader may not have any idea. And then think about the different ways you can write about DNA. Not everything has to go in the narrative, in the body of your report. Some things could go in a footnote, some things could go in an appendix. So consider where you could put this information. Remember, you are going to define the basic terms, not take things for granted, and then you'll be a little picky about the methodologies that you are going to discuss. Remember that this is for yourself as well as your reader. And so you will want to pick out those things that really helped you come to some sort of a conclusion. So good luck as you write up your DNA research and consider all those things we've talked about so it can help you and your reader to have a better experience in reading and writing your report. Thank you.